You step into the royal birthing chamber, the air so thick with incense and sweat that your lungs burn with every breath. The marble walls, normally symbols of triumph and stability, seem to tremble under the weight of what is unfolding. Torches flicker as though reluctant to witness the scene, their smoke curling upward like souls trying to escape. At the center of the room, a queen lies drenched in sweat, her cries piercing the silence like blades. Around her, midwives scurry with trembling hands, their eyes darting between bloodied cloths and one another's faces, whispering prayers they do not dare say aloud. And then you hear it, thy first wail of the newborn king, a sound that should symbolize hope and renewal, but instead freezes the blood in every vein. The infant is lifted high, but instead of cheers, gasps ripple through the chamber. His limbs are twisted, his head lopsided beneath the crown of damp hair, his features a grotesque parody of royalty. The court physician clears his throat as if preparing to announce the child's health, but the words choke in his mouth. The priest steps forward with a forced smile, muttering blessings that sound more like curses, his voice trembling under the weight of what he sees. In that moment, you realize you are not witnessing the birth of a savior or a leader, but the arrival of a symbol and omen wrapped in royal swaddling, cursed, punished by the gods. You see courtiers cross themselves. Some bow their heads in pity, others turn away entirely. This is not joy, this is horror in silks and gold. The cradle that waits to hold him now looks more like a coffin carved too early, a reminder that the dynasty may already be collapsing under the weight of its own sins. And yet, as the child is wrapped in fine linens, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. You hear the midwives whisper that this is the price of royal arrogance, of a bloodline too obsessed with purity, too desperate to keep its power intact. They speak of the king and queen cousins by blood, united not by love but by ambition. Their marriage had been celebrated as divine, blessed by the church, sanctified by tradition. But to the people in this chamber, staring at the trembling infant who struggles even to breathe, it looks like the gods have delivered their verdict. Outside, bells toll to announce the birth, echoing across the capital like triumphant fanfare. But within these walls, everyone knows the sound is hollow. You see the nursemaid hesitate to cradle him, her hands shaking as if she fears contamination, as though touching this child will curse her own bloodline. The priest sprinkles holy water over the infant's face, but even he cannot hide the look of dread etched across his features. In that moment, you understand the enormity of this scene. This is not just the story of one deformed king. It is the embodiment of a kingdom's obsession with bloodlines turned into a living nightmare. This child will never be seen as innocent, and yet he is king. His first breath is a royal decree. His first struggle, a mirror of the dynasty itself, fighting desperately to hold on even as it rots from within. Just shifted. You stand there, the echo of his cries still rattling the air, and you know this kingdom has birthed not just a ruler. Lamps hiss and spit as their flames licked glass chimneys, stretching your shadow across a wall crowded with family trees like ivy choking a fortress. Cousins loop into cousins, aunts become wives, uncles become fathers twice over. The ink itself seems to knot a monk, his tonsure shining like a coin rubbed smooth, traces a thin finger along Latin entries and murmurs the official blessing that once allowed what should never have been allowed. Royal dispensations signed by saintly seals, dispensations obtained because borders needed calming, dowries needed landing, and thrones needed heirs who would not split a realm into quarrels. You hear the logic rehearsed in polished phrases. Purity, they say, is stability. Blood is the mortar, but the mortar is crumbling. You can feel before you ever see them. The hush in the nursery, the tiny coffins carried through side doors before dawn, the midwife who stops singing and starts praying, the court physician who keeps his eyes on the basin so he does not have to look at the mother's face. Healers whisper what priests dare not publish, that the same heraldic colors are beginning to show up in the injuries of the flesh-blue blood that will not clot, too narrow to birth anything but grief. The archivist closes his eyes when he reaches the king's entry, the newest knot in the rope. He inks the name with nervous care, and you realize the page is not a celebration of continuity, but an autopsy in slow motion. The court prefers the word providence. The people outside say curse. You recognize both as different masks for the same truth, a dynasty so terrified of dilution that it drank itself into sickness. The pages flutter in a draft, and to your startled eye, the trees seem to sway, not with life, but with fatigue. Roots tangled around roots, blossoms feeding on the same soil until the soil is gone. You hear the phrase, born to rule, echo through the gallery, and think of how often born must be followed, in whispered corridors and guarded chapels, by but not to thrive. When you leave the archives, the palace courtyard feels brighter than it should, as if the sun itself were performing loyalty for a court that no longer deserves it. Trumpets flare. A herald reads proclamations laced with sugar. The king thrives. The king is strong. The king is an omen of plenty. You have seen the ledger where such fictions are accounted, where the cost of making them believable is itemized down to the last coin. Tailors sew shirts with slanted seams to hide a twisted shoulder. Cobblers craft asymmetrical soles so a limping gait becomes a ceremonial stride. A goldsmith designs a scepter heavy enough to counterbalance a crooked spine, calling it gravity for majesty, as if the phrase could trick the bones. Meanwhile, the marriage council plots the next alliance, as if nothing has been learned another. Niece, a cousin twice removed, whose dowry conveniently rings a frontier like a chain of forts. The counselors speak of arithmetic, while the physicians speak of omens. The clergy, caught between scripture and stipend, preach that suffering refines sovereignty, that kingship is a cup none drink without bitterness, and you hear, behind their homily, a quieter arithmetic. How many fast days will it take to hide how many funerals? In the kitchens, rumor bakes like bread. People tell each other what the portraits deny. The king's jaw grinding at night until teeth splinter like old tiles. His hands cramped into claws that must be unstuck with warm oil before a treaty can be signed in steady script. You notice how the palace has learned to choreograph reality. Doors at just the right width, steps at just the right rise. Every accommodation is praised as innovation, every contrivance baptized as tradition, and you feel the queasy admiration that such perfection demands. But beneath admiration lives a quieter knowledge, as deep and sullen as water trapped beneath ice. A garden overbred will not bear fruit forever. You glance back at the windows of the nursery, where the curtains are still, and count the silences that money cannot fill, silences, like missing branches, like names that never made the scroll. Power here is not a sword, it is a tourniquet. It stops a bleeding long enough for the crowd to cheer and the ledger to balance. But tourniquets do not heal. They only delay the reckoning. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. You enter the wardrobe hall, really a chapel devoted to fabric and brassen. Find artisans moving with the reverence of priests. The king's armor hangs on a stand, sculpted to mimic perfect symmetry, a lie in polished steel. A seamstress pries pearl teeth from a collar so she can restring them along a slant that will trick the eye into believing the shoulders beneath are level. A painter holds up a small board, lacquered to a mirror sheen. You glimpse yourself, and then the portrait he is correcting. The king reimagined into balance, the jaw softened, the eyes aligned, the very skull edited until it matches the geometry of glory. You are told, this is not deception, it is duty. A kingdom cannot bow to uncertainty. The painter's brush salts the canvas with light, the divine right of proportionality. In the next room, a carpenter demonstrates the secret of the throne. One leg milled shorter, another wedged with a hidden brass plate, cushions layered in a precise gradient, so that when the king sits, he rises, miraculously, to the level of his ancestors. Pages rehearse the approach for steps, turn, pause, while the crier speaks the litany of titles, so the king may time his breath and straighten those parts that will obey. Even the carpet is a collaborator, woven with a pattern that confuses the eye, so that a falter appears a flourish. You watch a rehearsal for the balcony scene. The crown is handed last, because its weight corrects the tilt of the head for those crucial heartbeats when the crowd first roars. So much genius bent to camouflage, so much beauty conscripted to save a single syllable from the word pity. In a corner, a physician warms a brace over a brazier until it glows the color of old gold, and then cools it in spiced wine, as if scent could perfume pain. The brace will fit beneath the royal doublet. It will chafe until skin blisters, and the blisters become scars that the historian will later celebrate as marks of endurance. You begin to understand that here, creation is not for joy, but for containment. The palace does not produce art, it produces alibis. And yet, even as you recoil, you cannot deny the thrill when the rehearsal reaches its crescendo. The doors fly wide, the trumpets split the air, and a figure steps forward, framed in light, transformed into the very image the realm requires. You know how the miracle was made. You still watch, breath held, as though the transformation were not a labor, but a blessing. And then comes the day when the miracle must face the weather. The square below the balcony heaves like a sea, all foam and shout, every window a gull, every alley a riptide of rumor. You can feel the need radiating upward, people starved not merely for bread, but for coherence, for a shape to their future that does not wobble. The chamberlains repeat their choreography, 4 steps, turn, pause. The scepter is shifted subtly to counterweight the spine. The crown is lowered by a hand that has measured the tilt to the 1/8 of an inch. For a breathless moment, it holds the picture, the chant, the illusion that power has a body worthy of it. Then the wind slides its knife between curtain and pillar, and lifts the drape just enough to make a shadow jump, just enough to show to those who are hungry to see that grandeur is braced and buckled, that the king is stitched into his majesty like a sail patched in storm season. The murmur begins. It is small, like gnats, and then it is a cloud. Somewhere a child laughs in the wrong rhythm. Somewhere a knife grinder stops turning his wheel. You feel the balcony stiffen beneath your feet as fear changes its pitch. Harold, to his credit, does not falter. His voice goes higher, brighter, drowning doubt in syllables polished by 1,000 ceremonies. The king raises a hand. The crowd's answer jolts the square back into ritual. Long live, ordered over, look closer. And yet the air is different after the curtains twitch. You sense the palace will tighten the choreography tonight. Add a gram to the scepter. Shave a sliver from the throne. Commission a new portrait with a line of light that corrals the wayward jaw. You know they will win the next appearance, the way gamblers sometimes win by doubling their bet. But you also know, in the pit, that truth carves beneath every spectacle, that the wind will come again. It always comes. The kingdom can seal windows, wait hymns, train heralds until their voices are iron, and still a draft will find the one place where honesty can stir. That is the problem with palaces that make masks. They must live in weather that has never signed a treaty. Asterisk, you are led into the royal schoolroom, a chamber more prison than classroom. The air smells of ink, wax, and damp wool. Windows are barred, not for security, but for secrecy. No peasant, I must glimpse how fragile the foundation of their world truly is. The walls drip with tapestries depicting heroic ancestors, knights who broke sieges, queens who bore dynasties, emperors whose crowns glowed like suns. Yet at the center of this theater sits a boy who cannot hold his quill without his wrist seizing, whose jaw clenches so tightly around each vowel that his tutors wince as though they, too, are trapped in his throat. You notice how the lesson is not about knowledge, but about containment, about training the body to perform power even when it aches. The tutor guides the boy's hand across parchment, forcing his letters into rigid order. Each time the pen jerks, the paper tears, and the silence after feels louder than a cannon. The boy's eyes flicker with panic. He knows the stories the servants whisper, the word cursed, hovering like smoke. A physician in the corner taps a silver rod against the boy's skull, not for treatment, but for measurement, as if to prove that pain can be quantified into legitimacy. Outside the door, courtiers rehearse how they will interpret each twitch, a divine test, a sign of mystical destiny, a reminder that rulers are chosen not because they are perfect, but because they suffer more than others. Yet, even as they spin scripture into excuses, you see the child's shoulders collapse inward, his back folding like parchment, curled too long in damp. He is not learning arithmetic. He is learning the art of hiding the wince. He is not reading scripture. He is memorizing which prayers are shortest, easiest to say when his breath runs thin. He is not writing history. He is being written into its instinct as a symbol of continuity, even as his body betrays him letter by letter. The cruelty of the lesson is that no one ever tells him the truth. Tutors smile with lips stretched like bowstrings. Courtiers clap at the smallest syllable as if it were thunder. Priests tell him he is chosen, though their eyes dart away when his hands tremble too violently to hold the Eucharist. He begins to believe that suffering is not a symptom but a crown, and in a way the palace needs him to believe exactly that. For the boy's agony is the glue holding a fracturing myth together. Each cough, each stumble, each grimace is polished into allegory. See how our king endures. So must we. Yet you, watching from the edge of the room, notice the fractures deepen. Children are supposed to dream of horses, of hunts, of secret gardens, where they can run barefoot and unafraid. But this boy dreams only of keeping still. His nightmares are of falling before the crowd, of dropping the chalice, of coughing blood onto embroidered silk, while dignitaries measure his failure like accountants. And worst of all, the palace applauds these nightmares when they come true. Each fainting spell becomes a sermon. Each missed step is proclaimed an omen. In teaching him to conceal weakness, they have taught him only one true lesson, that his humanity is a liability. You see it in the way he forces a smile until it cracks, in the way he recites Latin not to understand, but to survive, in the way he looks at portraits of his ancestors, as if begging them for a secret cure. But the portraits never answer, and the silence of their painted mouths is louder than any blessing. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. You are summoned next to the physician's chamber, a place where science has not yet been born, and faith in suffering still masquerades as cure. Copper instruments gleam on tables, their shapes less medicinal than martial, hooks, blades, clamps, that could as easily dismantle armor as mend a body. The king is brought in, swaddled in velvet, not because he is cold, but because every seam of his flesh trembles at touch. The physician bows low, not to the patient, but to the hierarchy that demands ritual over remedy. He murmurs Latin invocations while mixing powders of crushed bone, dried herbs, and mercury that gleams like liquid silver. A page lifts the goblet to the king's lips, and you watch the boy swallow poison disguised as salvation. The court believes this is medicine. You, with modern eyes, recognize only torment in a prettier cup. When the king retches, the physician declares the treatment successful, for surely evil spirits flee through vomit. When the boy's gums bleed, the court applauds. The sickness is draining out. Each agony is recorded not as failure, but as evidence of divine testing. You watch a barber surgeon draw leeches from a jar, their wriggling bodies eager for blood, and attach them to the king's pale arms. Drops of crimson spread through the linen. The boy flinches, and the priest murmurs patience is piety. But you see the truth. Every drop of blood is a note in a ledger of exhaustion. Every convulsion an entry in a book of suffering that grows heavier with each treatment. Medicine here is not meant to heal. It is meant to sanctify pain into proof of divine favor. The most terrifying part is not the treatments themselves, but the reverence surrounding them. Courtiers gather to witness the rituals, nodding solemnly as if torture were theater. The physician waves incense over wounds, declaring the smoke will chase away corruption. The Queen Mother clutches her rosary so tightly that beads crack under pressure, whispering that each cut is another step toward heaven. The boy is taught to believe it too, that every sting, every slice, every swallowed draught of bitter alchemy is not destroying him, but elevating him. He repeats prayers between gasps, not because he hopes for healing, but because he fears that silence will make the pain meaningless. You notice how quickly the chamber transforms into chapel, how swiftly medicine becomes liturgy, how efficiently the king's anguish is translated into propaganda. See, the courtiers whisper, "He bleeds for us as Christ bled." And in that moment you realize the grotesque genius of the system. The king's broken body has become the kingdom's greatest relic. His deformities are relics, his treatments, sacraments, his suffering, the only gospel this court knows how to preach. Outside, peasants starve. Within, the palace starves its king of hope in order to feed its myth. You smell the iron temps of blood mixed with incense, and you understand why history often reads like scripture, because agony is easier to sanctify than to cure. Asterisk. The bells of the cathedral toll, their sound rattling the stained glass windows as if even stone trembles at what is about to unfold. You are pushed along with the crowd into the great hall, the place where kings are made, not by coronation, but by spectacle. Today, the boy king will show his face, not because he is ready, but because the court requires proof that their myth still walks on two legs. You see him before the doors open, seated in a gilded chair too large for his body, draped in robes whose weight alone could crush his frail spine. His attendants dust white powder across his cheeks to hide the gray pallor, layer perfume to smother the sour smell of sweat. A crown is lowered onto his head, pressing against his malformed skull like a manacle. He tries to lift his chin, but it wobbles, and the chamberlain hisses, "Steady," as if steadiness could be commanded by fear. Then the doors open, and the roar of trumpets drowns the boy's shallow breath. He rises, barely, each step rehearsed to mask trembling knees. The crowd does not see the wince, because courtiers clap on cue, drowning silence with sound. From the gallery, peasants gasp at the gleaming robes, the halo of gold, the child who looks carved from marble. They do not notice how his fingers curl unnaturally against the scepter, how his lips twitch with pain each time he forces them into a smile. The illusion works because it must. The king's body may be cracked porcelain, but the paint is thick enough to convince those desperate to believe. You watch the crowd bow, and you feel the strange alchemy of suffering turned into authority. Every cough is swallowed as reverence, every limp painted as humility, every deformity presented as divine uniqueness. Yet you, standing close enough to see the sweat bead on his temple, know the truth. The mask is slipping, and the child underneath is suffocating beneath its weight. The ritual continues with grotesque precision. Nobles step forward to kiss the boy's ring, and each must pretend not to feel how cold his hand is, how damp his skin. Priests chant blessings, louder than necessary, their voices drowning the shallow wheeze of the child's lungs. Every gesture is scripted. The king raises the chalice, though the cup rattles against his teeth. He extends the scepter, though his arm trembles violently. The courtiers, trained in denial, cheer louder at each falter, as if applause can disguise collapse. But beneath the thunder of ceremony, you hear the whisper of reality. The boy is not a ruler, but a relic propped upright by collective refusal to acknowledge his weakness. It is theater at its most cruel, a pageant where the protagonist is both actor and sacrifice. You watch his eyes flicker, half resigned as If he understands that the applause is not for him but for the illusion of him, he has become a living mask, a symbol stitched together with ritual and fear. And you realize something chilling. Masks do not last forever. Paint cracks, flesh falters. Even the most carefully rehearsed performance eventually reveals the human beneath. And when that day comes, when the boy collapses, not behind closed doors, but here, before thousands, the mask will shatter in public view. The kingdom will not see a frail child who tried. They will see betrayal. And history will not remember the effort to stand, but only the moment he fell. Asterisk, you stand in the antechamber, holding a brass basin. And for the first time you understand that medicine in a palace is not the art of healing, it is the choreography of hope. The king is wheeled in on a low chair, cushions stacked to force a posture his spine refuses to keep. His breath is shallow, not from panic, but from corsets of whalebone. The surgeons insist will teach his chest to remember the geometry of normal men. The chief physician, powdered and perfumed, arranges his silver instruments on velvet like a jeweler laying out diamonds. He speaks in confident flourishes humors, phlegm, cold, spleen, hot heart, while a younger scholar dutifully records every proclamation in a ledger that will outlive all of you. Leeches arrive in a jar like dull opals and are pressed to the boy's ankles. Their swollen bodies grow glossy with royal blood. Cupping glasses hiss when heated and then bite at his shoulders, raising purple moons that bruise the map of his back. There is a plaster of ground pearls and crushed lilies to whiten the scars, a syrup of saffron and vinegar to sweeten the blood, a decoction of antimony to purge the stubborn melancholy that pools, they insist, behind his eyes. When he winces, a courtier declaims that pain is proof of cure. When he coughs, the confessor whispers that suffering perfects kings. You keep your eyes on the basin, because if you look at the child, if you let your gaze meet the thin-lipped bravery he performs for the room, you might ruin the ritual by telling the simple, treasonous truth. This is not treatment. It is theater, staged for the council, for ambassadors, for the jealous uncles who need to believe that artifice can wrestle nature into obedience. Later, when the room thins and the perfumes settle, you wipe the blood rings from his skin and hear him thank you in a voice so quiet the tapestries must lean in to listen. He asks whether the leeches mind their work. You tell him they are well fed. Outside, the ledgers are signed, the vials stoppered, the prognosis lacquered with Latin. Inside, the boy's bones, the old arithmetic persists, angles miscounted at birth, equations that cannot be balanced with silver tools or holy words. The remedies grow stranger as the seasons turn. A celebrated alchemist unpacks gilded flasks, sun tincture, moon milk, and the grand elixir promising to coax the body back toward symmetry by reconciling metals inside the blood. The concoction tastes of cinnamon and coins. The king swallows dutifully while the alchemist lectures on the marriage of sulfur and mercury, as though chemistry could annul the marriage of cousin to cousin. Pilgrimages multiply by proxy. Relics arrive trussed in satin, each with a notarized miracle bone splinters that once steadied a saint's spine, thorns that straightened a martyr's neck at a gallows, a fragment of a staff that led Israelites through wilderness. Priests intone, physicians nod, courtiers kneel, the boy endures. On Fridays, the surgeons stretch him on a padded board and crank a winch until his vertebrae pop like distant knuckles. Afterward, he vomits from the pain, and the chamberlain calls it a cleansing. When fever blossoms, they raise a canopy of orange blossoms and vinegar, certain the vapors will lure malaise out through his skin. When the fever breaks, they claim triumph. When it returns, they rename the plague. You learn the palace glossary for failure, stubborn, refractory, idiosyncratic words that absolve the healer and indict the patient. Once, in a bold experiment, they fit him with a clockwork brace hidden beneath his doublet, hinges ratcheting all day like a tiny forge. By dusk, his ribs are striped in livid bands, but he turns his face to the gallery and smiles for the visiting duke, because the realm requires the lie. At night, when the brace is unbuckled and the jaw of pain unclenches, he asks you if the stars, mapped so exactly, ever correct themselves when they drift. You say yes because he needs a cosmos that apologizes. He sleeps at last, sweating through linen that smells of iron and roses, while in the next room the doctor writes another polished report, and the council rehearses how to declare victory without admitting war. Asterisk. You are summoned to the council chamber, where the air is as thick with genealogy as with incense. Charts unfurl across the table branches, braided into ropes, names looping back on names until the parchment looks less like a tree than a noose. The chancellor taps a knot of ink with his signet and pronounces it purity. The word means the opposite of what it says. They speak of alliances, of borders drawn with rings instead of swords, of dowries fat with silver and salt. The proposed bride is presented as an argument rather than a person, a princess of the blood, beautiful as a premise, related just closely enough to guarantee stability. You, who have spent nights lifting a crown from a skull that bruises under its own gilded weight. Here, only the arithmetic. Close cousin to close cousin added to close cousin equals the fragile sum seated on the throne. The boy king listens as if to a catechism. He is told that marrying outside the circle risks rebellion. Marrying within it guarantees continuity. No one speaks the forbidden third clause aloud. Marry within it and risk the same broken geometry that bends your bones. The Queen Mother's portrait watches from the wall, its varnish yellowing, its smile varnished too. When the council finishes, the child thanks them for their wisdom and dismisses the room with a gesture learned from men who have never struggled to lift their own arms. Alone, he asks you if love ever figured into policy. You search for the gentlest lie and fail to find one. The betrothal is inked before midnight, sealed with red wax that looks uncomfortably like blood. Bells ring the next morning to announce felicity. In the streets, bread is thrown to the poor. In the kitchens, a cake rises as high as hope. In the nursery, the old midwife counts rosaries faster than breath. The wedding is a fresco of splendor plastered over dread. You watch him walk, the nave, his gait rehearsed into grace, his bride radiant and rigid in a dress that clangs when it moves. The archbishop intones the liturgy. The choir folds gold. The congregation leans forward to see the miracle of continuity enacted by two children trained to impersonate adults. In the privacy, the ritual barely allows. The young couple exchange words that are more apology than vow. You leave them to the bedchamber, and the palace holds its breath, a whole polity suspended over a mattress. Hours later, the physician emerges with a carefully prepared smile and a carefully unstained sheet. The official story writes itself: auspicious, promising, fruitful. Whispered drafts tell other versions: pain too sharp, breath too short, fear too large for flesh that thin. Remedies are prescribed for vigor and patience. Charities are ordered to placate heaven. Months pass with the kingdom peering at the queen's waistline as if divination were a domestic skill. There is a quickening, then a silencing, a cradle ordered, then returned, a christening gown folded, then hidden in a chest with sprigs of lavender meant to keep moths and memory at bay. Courtiers avoid the king's eyes. The council drafts new genealogies with narrower spirals. Once more, the chancellor says, and fortune will relent. The king nods as if duty could persuade biology. At night, he sits by the hearth and asks you whether a kingdom can be inherited without inheriting its cages. You put another log on the fire to delay the answer. The flames leap, and for a moment, in that flickering light, he looks like a boy watching shadows make stories on a wall where pictures were meant to hang. Asterisk. Winter returns with the cruelty of something that has learned your home address. The king's joints swell like arguments. His spine lies about its intentions and then doubles back on the lie. A fever blooms and burns out and blooms again, each wave leaving him thinner, as if illness were sanding him toward an idea. In the streets, granaries fail after a summer of stingy rain. Famine teaches the poor to believe in patterns. A bent king, bent wheat, bent luck. Old prophecies resurface like driftwood. The health of the land mirrors the health of the sovereign. The poet warns, and hungry men prefer poetry that names a culprit. You accompany the king in a litter through a city that is simultaneously cheering and counting grievances. Mothers hold up children as blessings and accusations. A stone arcs from a rooftop and clips the litter's rim. The bearers stumble. A curtain twitches aside. For an instant, the crowd sees not the lacquered portrait, but the uncurated child. The gasp that follows is not quite pity and not quite rage. It is recognition, the most dangerous of human sounds. Priests denounce omens. Astrologers redraw the sky. A hawk escapes a noble's glove and circles above the procession as if choosing a descent. That night, pamphlets illegal, clever bloom, like mold in taverns. They whisper that the royal body is a ledger of ancestral sin. They print diagrams of family trees that look like hedges grown without light. They suggest that the remedy for crooked lineage is a straight blade. The king reads one by the fire, then feeds it to the flames, then asks for another, as if the truth might, with repetition, wound less. You notice how he holds his cup with two hands now, so it won't spill when pain makes him shake. The council pretends not to notice. The realm, which has survived wars and winters and worse, takes inventory of itself and finds too many debts and not enough grain. Someone will be elected to pay. The conspiracy does not so much begin as congeal. An uncle who smiles too broadly acquires new friends. A general discovers his conscience and keeps it in a chest with foreign coin. A bishop suddenly remembers an obscure rule about regencies when a king cannot stand unaided at vespers. You watch documents multiply like rabbits' petitions requesting assistance. prayers for interim stewardship, drafts of abdication, for the common good. At midnight, you meet a loyal captain under a statue of a saint who has never answered a prayer. He warns that the palace guard has been divided into thirds: 1/3 loyal, 1/3 bought, 1/3 waiting to salute the highest ladder. The king insists on speaking to the city himself from the balcony at dawn. You lace his brace. He grips the railing. Frost bites stone and skin alike. He tells the crowd what no proclamation ever dared, that a crown cannot iron a spine, that a kingdom is measured by the shelter it gives its weakest, that he will not sign what cowards draft in candlelit rooms. His voice frays, but the words land. For a moment, the street is a held breath again, but this time it is hope that pauses time. Then a trumpet cracks the air too close. Too soon the uncle steps forward with a proclamation sealed in a wax the exact color of blood. Soldiers pour into the square like punctuation marks. The crowd, human, frightened, hungry, chooses survival over bravery, as crowds almost always must. You pulled the king back from the railing just as the first missile thrown cup. Sacrament, he laughs once, a sharp, unbelieving sound, then coughs until the handkerchief in his fist becomes a red confession. In the corridor, you pass a mirror that has seen everything and offered judgment on none of it. For the first time, you do not avert your eyes. You see two people, a child learning how to break his own fall, and the shadow of a man who once believed that the right words in the right order could reroute history. They move him to a small chamber overlooking the orchard, the room chosen not for its grandeur, but for its morning light, which has the decency to be gentle. The bed is low, the chair is lower, the table is crowded with bottles that have all promised rescue without describing their price. He dictates in bursts now, sending you for ink when his hand cramps, sending you for silence when memory floods too fast. The document is not a will, it is a hinge. He orders the archives opened, the marriage contracts copied, the PayPal dispensations displayed in the square, where even the illiterate can see the shapes that trapped him. He drafts a decree that forbids the wedding of close blood, not as penance, but as apology to those not yet born. He names guardians who are enemies of one another, so that their rivalry will oblige them to fairness. He reverses a dozen petty cruelties, enacted by men who confused etiquette with law. Between paragraphs, he rests. Once, he asks you to read back the sentence that begins, "No child shall inherit our chains." You read it twice, and both times his mouth quivers into something almost like peace. The confessor arrives and is waved away, not out of arrogance, but because the boy has already confessed to you in 100 small ways, the way he thanked the leeches, the way he admired the courage of stars to hold their places, the way he forgave the crowd for choosing bread over bravery. Toward evening, when the orchard smells of cold bark and the documents lie finished like soldiers after a battle, he asks for the crown. You bring it, heavy as ever, and he sets it on the table instead of his head. "It looks lighter from here," he says, "and you do not trust your voice enough to answer." He signs the decree with a hand that shakes and does not apologize for shaking. A page sands the signature. The ink blooms into permanence. The law is born between coughs. At dawn, the barber surgeons come with their careful knives, not as butchers, but as librarians of flesh, men tasked with cataloging the last chapter of a book no one wanted to write. The autopsy is modest, more prayer than spectacle. They murmur measurements, fused sutures, a spine that hooks like a question mark, ribs that learn diplomacy by yielding where they should have argued. No one says the word incest, but the bones say it plainly in a grammar older than law. The uncle signs the testament with a face schooled in grief. Outside, the bells toll in the register, where sorrow and relief harmonize. The funeral is two ceremonies stitched together. The public procession that recrowns the idea of monarchy with laurel and trumpets, and the private goodbye where a handful of us place our palms on the plain pine inside the gold and thank the boy for carrying a weight that would have broken better men. Weeks later, the decree he signed begins its difficult life in the world. Priests argue footnotes. Lawyers argue margins. Village clerks, startled by authority from a dead child, update registers with new distances between cousins. It will not cure cruelty or abolish ambition or teach men to choose mercy over myth, but it will, quietly and repeatedly, prevent a few children from waking each morning inside a body at war with itself. You keep his quill, its feather bent where his grip insisted too hard on control. Sometimes, when the city forgets how close it came to choosing beasts over laws, you walk past the square where his edicts are carved into stone. People do not stop to read. They do not need to. The law is in their lives, now the wider marriages, the broader branches of family trees. The new habit of asking whether love can be both loyal and sane. You do not believe in saints, but you light a candle anyway, for a boy who learned too late that a king is not a mask but a mirror, and for a kingdom that, for once, chose to look